very warm greeting to all of you. Today we have with us Brian Sachetta. Brian is an author, blogger, and software developer from Boston, Massachusetts. He graduated from Boston College in 2012 with a degree in management and computer science. After college, Brian put his computer science background to use as both a consultant and a writer. His first book, Get Out of Your Head, draws parallels between computer systems and the human mind and gives readers practical strategies for overcoming anxiety. Much of Brian's writing is focused on health, wellness, and personal development. He is passionate about using his skills to positively influence the lives of others. So, thank you so much, Brian, for being here with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So, Brian, can you tell us about your journey from being a software developer to also being an author and a coach?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so much I could touch upon. I think probably the highest level thing to talk about is basically just something that I've talked about in previous, podcasts and summits before is basically, I didn't really sit down and say to myself like, hey, I'm going to be a software developer and I'm going to use that experience to figure out things in the mental health space and become a blogger or a writer or whatever. There was kind of these two paths that I was on that at times kind of wove together, right? So it was like, having dealt with anxiety in throughout my life, but kind of reared its head in high school and college, and then going through college and trying to figure out what career track I want to be on and that sort of thing. It was basically they were kind of just moving in lockstep with one another, wanting to figure out how I could handle anxiety on my own as well as help others, and then also make a career for myself, right? So I was interested in software development, creating mobile apps, creating brands and websites and that sort of thing. And so I kind of just followed the two as they went along. And eventually I think one of the things, so kind of going back to the idea of not really being methodical about like, hey, I'm going to follow these two paths specifically because they're related. I kind of made them related in a way, right? So I kind of said, hey, I'm doing this software development stuff. I'm doing this mental health stuff. How can I draw parallels between them? Because and the reason why I wanted to answer that question was because it's like these are my experiences, right? So usually you can speak best to the things that you've been through. So I was like, how can I take the things that I have gone through and help others with it? Because those are my experiences. That's what I know. That's what I'll be able to write about. That's what I'll be able to make the most sense of. And is it? I guess another question is like, does it make the most sense, or is it the best thing to? Is the best way to talk about anxiety to relate it to computer systems or mobile apps or whatever it is? I would say I don't know. It's just that's how I know how to make sense of things based on my experiences. And obviously I'm being high level and kind of vague here. So happy to talk about what all of that means in a little more detail.
Absolutely. Go ahead and share. And, our next question was about how your personal journey has helped you develop those strategies that you have shared in the book with people.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the parallels, it's not like, again, it's not like one to one, right? It's not like, okay, anxiety is exactly like software development in this regard but there are several topics within each subject that are similar. And so, I just to go into just to be a little bit more specific here, right? If I pick one of them specifically, I talk about in the book something called recursive anxiety. And so if we step back for a minute, right, and we say, okay, what does that word mean, recursive, right? Or if we take that like the root of that word, right, the noun recursion. So in computer science, right, when we're writing code and we're saying like, hey, this is how I want my program to respond to certain things or how I want it to function, right? You can take blocks of code and you can name them and you can so these are called methods or functions. So you may say like, a method that I have is called like log in, right? So if I have an app that I need to validate somebody's credentials, so I'm going to say, okay, take the username, take the password, try to log that person in. So I can call that block of code and I can reliably execute that functionality, right? So a recursive function in computer science is a function that calls itself. I'll probably kind of stop there in terms of like the technical analysis. It gets a little bit
You
it
can
gets a
go
little.
ahead because we also have software engineers in our audience, so they would love to hear you. So go ahead and you don't have to
Okay.
filter back at all.
Okay, sounds good. So, one of the most common examples of recursion in software development, or a kind of like almost like a question that you may get asked in an interview, right? Is like, can you write a function that you pass a specific number to, and it's going to try to map it to the equivalent of the Fibonacci number in real life. So, for example, like the Fibonacci sequence is this string of numbers that basically you add the previous two digits to get the third one, to get, I guess it is the third one. Yeah. So the Fibonacci sequence is basically like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. So you're taking any two digits, adding them together, and that gets you the third one. So when it comes to recursion, right? Like if we're trying to write this function, in order to find the 10th Fibonacci number, we need to find the 9th and the 8th and the 7th and the 6th and all the way down to the base cases, right? So that function within so in that function, right, it's saying like, if I say, get me the 10th one, within the actual code of that function, it's saying, okay, get me the 9th one. And it's not hard coded, right? It's not saying get me 9. It's saying get me n minus 1. And so it's calling itself, and it's pulling all those numbers back into one another. So again, that's kind of a high level view of what a recursive function is, right? It's calling itself. And so to relate this back to anxiety, something I talk about in the first book is the notion of recursive anxiety. So it's, and again, it's some of these parallels are not like one to one. Sometimes I have to stretch them a little bit, but the idea is that sometimes our anxiety calls itself and makes us more fearful, right? So maybe we start off by saying like, I'm worried about this conversation I have to have with my boss tomorrow, right? And it's an important conversation. We may be talking about my performance. We may be talking about my salary, things of that nature. I'm not entirely sure. But when I think about it, I'm nervous. And then as I continue to think about it, I become more nervous. And then the symptoms that I'm experiencing, whether it's like, sweaty palms, a racing heart, maybe the inability to think clearly, that gets magnified as I continue to think about what it is that's making me anxious, right? So that's kind of that recursive nature. And so you may start off by saying, I'm worried about a conversation I have with my boss tomorrow. And then you go, the recursive, or the function, we'll call it, right? The function of anxiety calls itself. And so, maybe we go on this process for 10, 20 minutes. And, we started by being worried about having a conversation with our boss, and 20 minutes later we're anxious about the fact that we haven't been to a social outing in a while. We feel like we're not where we want to be in our lives. We feel like maybe we are quote unquote losers, something like that, right? So the idea of basically saying to ourselves like, hey, I know that when my anxiety calls itself, when I continue to rehash some of my fears, I can go to places that number one, I obviously don't want to go, but can also be almost completely unrelated to the subject with which I started. And so to kind of wrap this concept up, right, we have in recursive functions, we have the concept of base cases, right? So like in the Fibonacci sequence, we know that we have to give our function something that will stop it, in the sense of like, we can't just say like n minus 1 all the way down to negative infinity, right? We need to be able to say like, okay, so the actual solution, right, is like basically the base case for n0 or n1 is 1, and the base case for n1 or n2, however you want to put a number to them, is 2. And so those kind of serve as the breaking points, or the exits to the loop, so to speak. So like if we're saying like, hey, go get me the 100th spot in the Fibonacci sequence, we're recursively hitting that function 98 times or whatever it is, maybe 99. I kind of forget, not really that important here, but excuse me. And so those base cases are what breaks us out. And so when it comes to anxiety, right, we almost need our own base cases. We need to be able to say, when I have the awareness that I am being anxious about something, whether it's like ruminating on a specific subject, like having a conversation with my boss, or I know that I've just spent 10 to 15 minutes going down this anxiety rabbit hole, I need some base case that breaks me out, right? Gets me out of the loop, stops calling the function. So that could be a number of different things. It's going to be different for every single person, depending on like, what is helpful for you. But some of the things that I like to do is I like to get up and go for a walk. I like to stand up and do 20 jumping jacks. I like to listen to my favorite song. The idea again is just have some condition that basically allows you to take your thinking and shift it like 180 degrees and break out of that function.
That is so fascinating and marvelous. Thank you so much, Brian. I love the way you have explained that. It's beautiful. And how would you like to talk about, a little more about the human mind and the computer systems, if you'd like to share a little more about.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, stop me if it gets too technical. I don't want it to be that way, but
I'm actually
um,
enjoying this, perspective. I think this is so beautiful, and I'm sure that in our audience, the software engineers and software developers are going to love this parallel that you're sharing with us.
cool. Yeah, and I mean, it is a different take, right? There's a lot of different. There are many takes on the market. People sharing their own strategies and whatnot for dealing with mental health. This is just the one that I know, and it is unique. Whether that's good or bad, that kind of remains to be seen. But I think it's interesting. I might be biased because this is my
Oh, I'm
software
finding
development
this
is my
so
career, but
fascinating. I'm finding this so fascinating. It's beautiful. So please share more.
cool. Yeah. So another concept that I talk about is so in computer science, or in the world of software development, there's an idea called the state machine. And so a state machine is it's a little bit tricky to describe. I just want to make sure that I get my actual words correct, but like a state machine is basically so if I step back for a second and I say, like, what is a state, right? So in ourselves we have like different feelings, right? You may say, like, I am in a sleepy state. I am in an anxious state. I am in a hungry state, things of that nature, right? It could be physical, it could be mental, depending on how you want to use the term. I mean, is again, with all this stuff, it's kind of like there's no hard and fast rules. I'm just trying to get some ideas across, right? And so when we move to software development, right, if we are building a mobile application or a specific function, or we are trying to model like a real world object in code. Um, the idea of a state in software development is it's kind of the notion of, like, okay, let's say I'm trying to model, like, an example that sometimes we used in college was like in some of the classes that I took was like, let's say we're trying to write code that models a bubblegum machine. And so that machine is going to have several different states. And I mean a bubblegum machine can't get hungry, right? But it can do several other things, right? So it could be in a state where it has plenty of pieces of bubblegum in it. It could be in a state where it's out of bubblegum. It could also be in a state where somebody has put a coin into the machine. It could be in a state where somebody hasn't put a coin into the machine. And some of those states, I mean, if we were being really semantic or whatever, like some of those states overlap. There may be one where it's like, out of gum, but has a quarter, has gum, but has no quarter, that sort of thing, right? And so a state machine is basically like the instruction manual for our software development, for our software program, that basically says, like, okay, here are all the states in which that this software program can get into and out of, and here's how it moves from each of those states, and then additionally, this is how it functions in each of those states. So, and this will make a little bit more sense in a minute, but so going back to the bubblegum machine idea, right? So let's say the bubblegum machine is in the out of gum state, right? So if somebody puts a quarter into the machine and we turn the crank, we're actually like, so how that machine is going to act, right? Like the how it's going to act in that specific state, it's going to say, hey, I know that there's a quarter in here and somebody's trying to crank it, but I don't have any gum, so I can't accept this quarter. So that's, that specific functionality is tied to that state. Whereas if the machine is in a different state, and let's say that specific state is, I have gum and I have a quarter, then when somebody turns the crank, I'm going to dispense a piece of bubble gum. And so if you think about, like, trying to create this map, like even if we're just trying to like write it down in pseudocode or something like that, or draw a diagram of it. So we start in, let's say we start in the no quarter, but we have gum state, right? So there's kind of nothing, there's no real functionality. Like the machine is just standing there, right? Waiting for somebody to come along. So there's really nothing that it does while in that state besides wait. If somebody comes along and puts in a quarter, we've now entered a new state. So that state might be like, has bubblegum, has quarter. Turn the crank, and then, like I mentioned, we're going to dispense that piece of bubblegum. And then once that piece is dispensed, our map basically says, like, hey, we now need to move to a different state. So that's going to be, I still have bubblegum in the machine, but I no longer have a quarter. And so this is a little vague, a little high level again, but so the idea is if we can take this notion of like what a state machine is, what this kind of if we're saying like, this is a map that details all the different states we can get into and out of, how we act in each of those states, and then how we get to and from each one, then in theory, and again, this is kind of another vague task, but it can be helpful, is to say when it comes to our mental health, whether it's anxiety, depression, something else, how do we act when we're in those states? And then what do we think we can do, or what have we identified that has been helpful for us to move us out of one of those disempowering states into something a little bit I don't know, more desirable, right? So for example, we can say, I know that when I'm anxious, so in the anxious state, I tend to ruminate, I tend to think about things that, negative things that could happen in my future. And then when I do that, I feel pretty terrible. So what I need to do is I need to step back and say to myself, like, how do I move out of that anxious state? What are some of the things that could help me achieve that? So it could be, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, is like, maybe we get up and we walk around for a little bit. Maybe we do some jumping jacks or listen to a favorite song. It's kind of bringing this awareness to some of the patterns in our minds and bodies that usually run subconsciously or without us even really giving too much thought to them. Basically just sitting down and saying like, hey, this is, kind of mapping our own behavior and then bringing a little bit more strategy to it to be able to say, I have the awareness that I'm in this particular state. I know that I tend to do these specific things when I'm in it, but I don't want to be in it anymore. So let me apply one of these strategies and try to get into a new one.
Absolutely powerful, reflective work, inner work. I love the way you have shared that, metaphor and analogy to bring it into action. So, how was it for you to map that out for yourself? So, when you had these panels come to you, how did you start reflecting? What was your process like?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, what I just mentioned was kind of the process. Obviously, it's a little bit different for everyone. And I think the anxiety journey or the mental health journey that everybody goes on is different, right? It's like for me, a lot of the things that I implemented, the things that I write about, a lot of the strategies that I came up with, it took me years to develop them, right? And I think, kind of a little bit unrelated to the question, but one of the things that I really wanted to do with my writing was, I looked at my situation and I said to myself, maybe I missed some of the information that could have helped me when I was 18. Maybe I didn't type the right search terms into Google or something like that. And so I didn't find that book that would have been invaluable to me or something like that. But it took me years and years to develop a lot of these strategies. And looking back on my own journey, I said to myself, like, I don't, I kind of wish it didn't take me that long, but it is what it is. So I'm here. But if I'm going to go down this journey of blogging and being an author and publishing books and that sort of thing, one of the key things that I want to achieve, or at the very least help folks with, is can I condense that timeline for them, right? So rather than having them say like, it took me 10 years to figure out how I could even begin to approach my anxiety, can I shrink that down to a year for them? Could I, maybe, I don't know. It's like if I got really good at SEO or something like that, in the sense of people know who I am, they can find my book pretty easily. If they're like, hey, how do I do this, right? With mental health, right? How do I overcome anxiety or something like that? If my content pops up first and I feel like my content is valuable, then maybe they find that, and very quickly they're able to implement some of the solutions that took me years to develop, but hopefully they can do it quickly, and then they can kind of save themselves some of that grief, some of that agony along the way.
That's absolutely sweet. Brian, would you like to tell us, you've spoken about very straightforward, having a straightforward approach, which is different from the other techniques that you may have come across or have read of. Would you like to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I kind of think what you're getting at, right, is almost the boldness or the brashness of the message, right? I tend not to sugarcoat things, and that comes across, like, I don't know if anybody's on the video, but like, so this is the logo for the brand, but it's this snake brain, right? And it's kind of in your face, and so I guess one of the things that I came across when I was reading, researching, trying to help myself with my anxiety and depression, things of that nature, was like, don't get me wrong, today the the marketplace, the space is in a much better place than it was in 2008, kind of when I started this journey. But for a long time, it felt like it was very fragmented. There wasn't a lot of info out there. Some of the info wasn't very helpful, things of that nature. And so, I would read different books and stories and blog posts and whatnot. And one of the things that I didn't enjoy was like kind of this dancing around anxiety and depression, right? Being like, oh, like everything's going to be okay and it's going to be fine. And, it's all sunshine and rainbows out there and whatnot. I felt like a lot of those solutions, because they didn't really acknowledge what folks were going through, what I was going through, it seemed just to not really hit home, right? And so the reason why I am straightforward with my message is I'm trying to, obviously dealing with mental health issues is very difficult, but I'm trying to like accelerate the process. I want to be able to pinpoint, right away, like, hey, what are some of the things that you're feeling? What are some of the things that you're dealing with, rather than kind of dancing around it? And then once we've made that determination, we can more quickly figure out like where we should take it from there, right? They kind of I'm trying to think of the old adage, which is basically like, you can't begin to deal with a problem until you admit that you have it, or something like that. It's kind of that notion, right? Is like, look, let's kind of put the BS down, right? And let's say, this is how things currently stand. This is what I'm dealing with. How do I chart a path forward, rather than like, oh, maybe, I don't really deal with these things. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to feel it, whatever, right? In some ways, this is kind of also the notion of like the obstacle is the way, right? That you can't go around the obstacle. You almost have to go through it. There are definitely some nuances to that I want to be careful of. Like, there are some strategies out there where it's like, you face your anxiety head on and you tell it you're not going to back down and you fight it and whatnot. Like, that is a strategy that I really, really don't like, and don't think works. But I do like the idea of just being honest with ourselves, right? Saying, hey, I'm admitting that this is something that I struggle with. And in making that admission, I can now figure out how I'm going to move forward. If that makes sense. And I don't know, did that answer the
It
question?
absolutely makes sense. And this conversation is just so beautiful and exciting. It's really lovely. Thank you so much, Brian, for being here and sharing that. And one of the reasons why we have this summit is so that we can open up more conversations around mental health and the importance of holistic well being. And interestingly, we are at a significant point in human evolution where more and more awareness is coming forth in terms of mental health, right? What could you share some of your insights about mental health for men specifically?
Yeah, I think so. I think an important one is kind of, and I talked about this on a podcast recently, was the notion of like masculinity, right? And so there are a million different ways that we hear the word masculinity all over the place these days. There's like toxic masculinity, just the normal notion of masculinity and whatnot. I think in a lot of ways, masculinity does get a bad rap these days. I think that's the tide is kind of turning on that in some fashion. But when I'm talking about masculinity, what I'm saying is like the old school notion of like, push my fears, push my emotions down, don't think about them, don't worry about them, whatever it is, just kind of like brute force your way through it. If you were talking with your friends, especially in like not elementary, but middle school or high school or something like that, maybe college, folks may say like, this is in guy circles, right? They may be like, oh, suck it up, get through it, whatever it is. So when it comes to, men dealing with anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, whatever it is, it's difficult because society or our culture can sometimes say to us, suck it up, push through it, don't worry about it, whatever it is. That can be kind of toxic, right? It's like, if you are actually dealing with something, the most important thing, as we talked about a minute ago, is not to ignore it and say, again, sunshine, rainbows, whatever it is. It's to say, and again, I don't want to glamorize this notion, but is to kind of like confront it head on, and not in a like a warrior mentality, but just like a level headedness, saying like, this is something that I deal with. I'm not going to push it away. I'm going to, in a reasonable fashion, I'm going to say like, this is where I am. This is where I am today. This is where I would like to be. How do I get there? Right. Rather than saying, this isn't something that I deal with. This isn't something that I have to worry about. I'm going to suck it up or whatever. I think that when we subscribe to the quote unquote like old school notions of masculinity, it kind of gets us to a spot where like we repress our feelings and then they emerge years later in a much worse state or a much more powerful position than they were when we first needed to deal with them, right? And that's obviously not a good thing. So what I kind of say, um, when I talk about masculinity, what I would say is like a new school masculinity is the idea of, instead of like saying suck it up, be a man, whatever, it's saying, I am not afraid. I might not want to do it, but I'm not necessarily afraid to confront difficult things. And again, that doesn't make them easy. It just means that I'm going to do it, right? So it may say, look, I had a panic attack yesterday. I deal with anxiety all the time, whatever it is. That totally stinks. Like we're not going to dismiss that notion. Like we're not going to make light of what we're going through, but we are going to just be realistic about it, right? We're going to say something I deal with, might not be happy about it, might not be proud of it, whatever it is, but that's how it is. And in order to get where I want to go, I need to understand that. And then I need to be able to talk to the folks that can help me. If I'm not specific in what I'm dealing with, if I'm not truthful in what I'm dealing with, how are they going to know what it is that I need help with?
Absolutely. So, in terms of mental health in the workplace, what have your observations been like?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things, right? With the pandemic, I think most folks have not been to the office all that much. It started to come back a little bit in the past few months, and now with one of the variants spiking up, it feels like that's kind of reversing trend or whatever, right? But I would say, speaking to experiences before COVID, was that it kind of felt like there wasn't a lot of, in some of the companies that I worked for, like it just wasn't, mental health was not addressed too much. And that's not, I'm definitely not like, I'm not saying that to point fingers or, be upset with anyone or anything like that. It's sort of one of those things, right? Where it's like, as you alluded to, where like the world is becoming a bit more aware. There's more, for lack of a better word, there's more awareness about some specific conditions, whether it's anxiety or depression or something like that. There are definitely some companies that you see, whether they're posting online or something like that, pay a little bit more attention to, employee well-being, mental well-being, things of that nature. I don't think I've really worked in a company that has like put a serious, I don't know exactly how to phrase it, but put a serious game plan together in terms of like, hey, this is how we support people in their mental health battles or whatever it is. And again, not pointing any fingers there. I think that's kind of just indicative of like, hey, this is somewhat of a new thing for most of the world, most of society. And so I think it's going to be, I will say that like, companies are obviously starting to pay more attention to how people feel. And again, it depends on what your own personal experience is, right? Like if you've worked in a company, if you work for Headspace, it's like they're going to prioritize mental health very, very well, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of comes down to your own personal experience. But my guess would be that, especially given that like everybody has worked from home for a really long time here, obviously going through this very uncertain time with the virus and whatnot, it's like it's spooky times out there, right? And so I think companies, even if the methodologies or the game plans aren't necessarily set in stone or specific or whatever it is, there's definitely a little bit more attention paid to like, hey guys, how are you doing today, or whatever it is, right?
Right.
Just as an example, the company that I now work for, last year, they did give a day off for employees, two employees, for, it was just called a mental health day, right? And so, I don't know. I think that may have been more specific to the actual, like, the heat of the pandemic or something like that. I don't know. I don't think we have any of those anymore. But I think of the fact that companies are still trying to figure it out. And so I think if we were to condense it down into like a sentence or two, it's like, sure, there are definitely some positive movements in the space, but I think in general, we're still trying to determine, and companies are still trying to determine, like, what's the best move, what's going to help people the best. And in hopefully the next 10 years, there'll be a serious game plan, and it'll just be kind of, I don't know, a thing where it's like you go to work for a company and there are legitimate mental health benefits or something like that, right?
Yes, yes, and we hope that that happens soon. So, thank you, Brian. If people would like to reach out to you, or look you up, where's the best place for them to connect?
Yeah, a good place would be getoutofyourhead.com. You can also reach me on Instagram. Right now, my handle is Get Out of Your Head Books. That's all one word. That may change soon. I'm trying to get a different one, but I gotta wait for my trademark to clear. So for now, you can catch me there. It doesn't look like it's me specifically. It looks more like my brand, but I am operating that account for the time being. So
Wonderful. So I encourage all those of you who have really connected with Brian's share right now, which has been absolutely fascinating, to go get the book.
yeah, sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. Any last words before we sign off for today?
What I usually say at the end of some of these conversations, right, is just kind of like a message to listeners and readers is, you know, kind of the recurring theme or message across this conversation is like, dealing with mental health issues is very difficult, and we're not going to make light of them, but at the same time, like I I would say to readers and listeners, like, no matter what you're going through, just know that you're not alone. Know that there are folks out there that are experiencing the same things that you are. If you feel like you need somebody to talk to, or you don't have somebody that you can share your message with, like, shoot me a message. I'm happy to get back to you. It might not be within an hour, but I definitely will get back to you. So
Thank you, Brian. And yeah, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
absolutely.